Welcome to The Last 50 Feet, the podcast about what happens when autonomous vehicles actually arrive at the curb. Every week, we get into what is moving in autonomous commerce, what's stalling, and who's building what next. No fluff, all signal, and we keep it brief. That's our thing. Let's get into it.
Welcome to the Autonomous Commerce Podcast, The Last 50 Feet. I am Cam Herring, head of sales. We have Ben Seidel, CEO, and specifically today, very excited because we are joined by Kyle. You're here too. I'm sorry.
Thanks. Kyle. I thought you were saying me, and I went like this, and that's fine.
Specifically excited to talk with Kyle, of course, Kyle, but specifically excited to talk with essentially like you are basically David Moss, the Meriwether Lewis of full self-driving, if you will.
I like that.
You've made the first two overland journeys from coast to coast in full self-driving.
Yeah, all the way across the United States and then last week driving all the way across Canada as well on a 100% full self-driving. Every single inch of the drive, no touch of the steering wheel, no pedal, no nothing. So pretty exciting time to be alive.
Dude, super impressive. It's great to have you here today.
Yeah, thank you. I'm coming to you from a Supercharger in Rawlings, Wyoming, in the middle of nowhere. I was at I'm speaking about my time in Canada at a Tesla meetup in Muskegon, Michigan, right on Lake Michigan on the western part of the state, and then drove 1,000 miles yesterday, and then now I'm inching closer back home to Seattle.
If you're the Lewis of full self-driving, who's your Clark?
I'd have to say, the two guys I was with last week in Canada, Devin Olson and Spencer. He goes by @ScottsRule08 on X, but I would have to say that they couldn't have done the last trip without him.
Amazing. So yeah, we'd for our audience, would love to kind of get a quick background on yourself. I mean, how you became this person in the community. I know I watched your rise over X over the last year and a half or so, maybe year, and you're absolutely the name in the game as far as the person who's putting on the most miles on FSD, out there testing all of the newest Tesla software, putting the cars to the test. You're living and breathing this stuff. So tell us a little bit about how you got here, because I know this wasn't always your thing.
Yeah. So, starting in the very beginning, I like to talk about just, being a young man, I just had, motor trend, car and driver, road and track sent to the house. So from very early age, just all about cars, all about everything. It was more about, Lamborghinis and, sports cars, nothing about, electric vehicles. And then you start to, fan of Lotus, and then you see the first Tesla Roadster, reading about that. My grandfather, he was a big influence with me in cars, and he was all about electric. He was an electrician by trade, one of his careers, and knew how to repair everything, get his hands on stuff. And as soon as YouTube came out, he was starting to show me drag racing videos of custom electric vehicles versus sports cars and everything else, and then blowing it out of the water. So I had a pretty early introduction to that, and just about like the instant torque, and he would do some tunes to his golf cart and things of that sort. And then, read about Roadster, read about Model S. I'm still in middle school at the time, maybe in elementary school, I guess, or it must have been more middle school. I'm 29 years old now. But always a fan of it, but I'm 13, 14 years old. I can't buy myself $100,000 car at the time. And, just always been a fan, become an adult, have my, sports cars, same kind of love, cars, vehicles. And then, 6-7 years ago, I started to do this kind of traveling that I do now. I just recently had my birthday about a month and a half ago now. But when I turned 29 years old, when I started like full, traveling on the road so much, was like right around the week of my 21st birthday. And I was doing the math there, and that 8-year stint between 21 and 29, I was on the road 48% of the time. It was 1,403 nights in a hotel, I calculated, and just always been driving, always been, just excited about being on the road, just doing travel and sales. And then, so, never hated, the idea of electric vehicle. And then, Tesla, eventually releases their paint it black self-driving vehicle. I think that's pretty cool. Always been about, in tech and stuff. Like right before hopping on here, listening to WWDC from Apple today, talking about all their, the new Siri, iOS 27, etc. Um, so the idea of how much I like cars and driving, just the idea of being, chauffeured around, was a always appealing as well. Kind of fast forward a bit, but I have a full size truck at the time. I had a Ram, and then I had an Audi sedan. I find myself at a Delta Lounge in Phoenix, Arizona, and I was on Twitter at the time. See that Tesla's live on unveiling the Cybertruck. I watched the event. I actually think the Cybertruck looked pretty cool. I saw it had the 500 miles of range and how low the initial cost estimate was going to be. So I put in a deposit right then and there at the lounge before I boarded the flight. As soon as the presentation was over, was blown away with all the specs and everything. I've always driven about 50,000 miles a year or so. So, always before in the charging infrastructure. And so I just never thought I could live with an electric vehicle easily. One thing comes to another. I always wait on the Cybertruck. It gets delayed. It gets delayed. It gets delayed. But then I get my name, pretty early on called in March of 2024. And so I get this Cybertruck. I love it to death. Use the crap out of it. But we're kind of the story and me and self-driving, really begins is last summer. I was having a little too much fun off-roading in the Cybertruck, and I actually totaled it off-roading.
Did you?
Yeah. So on there, and so I was in need of a new vehicle. I got paid out by insurance. I was on a U.S. Forest Service road. And so I got my check, and it took a while. I was, fighting with them. It's a, unique situation to happen on a dirt road and such like that. But, last year and, September, the tax credit was ending, and this was right around the time of the wreck. So I was like, I need to buy a vehicle. I need to buy something while I'm settling out, getting the big payout of my truck. And so Tesla, I go on their website. I'm like, oh, what's new? What can I buy? And this Model 3 I'm coming into you today. They said if you buy a Model 3 in Q3, you get a free year of supercharging, unlimited usage. And for somebody like me, driving 50,000 miles a year at the time, that was going to be a $7,500 promo plus the $7,500 promo from the government. So I was like, okay, this is great. I don't necessarily want a Model 3. I like the idea of a full size truck. Love my Cybertruck, but basically a free $7,500 is really hard to pass up. So I was like, all right, I'm gonna use and abuse this for a year, and then we'll figure out next steps. So I bought this September 20th of last year. I'm coming to you right now in it. I've put 48,000 miles on it
Wow.
since last September. And so in there, so on my job, actually, ironically selling lidar. I wanted to make a big year-end push. I was, loving the car, loving the self-driving, always loving the road. I talked to my boss and I said, I want to make a drive all the way around the country as a product manager, in sales role for the company I worked for. And I was like, I want to make a big USA tour, basically. And I left on that tour on October 28th. And that was on version 13 of full self-driving. And then eventually in Calgary, Alberta, I got version 14.1. And then, when, everything starts to really, shoot off, 14.2 came out. I was in Raleigh, North Carolina. I downloaded it. I noticed there was this new self-driving stats page. And I said, hey, okay, that's cool. I saw some, people talking about it. Whole Mars catalog, a bunch of the early access people saying like, hey, it's going to track exactly how often you use the self-driving. And I knew I needed to drive that next day from Raleigh to Charlotte. I had some stops along the way, and I was like, okay, let's see if I can actually do 100.0% of my driving today. The car does everything. Let's see what it takes. If it misses a exit, if it does anything around, like, we'll go nice and slow. Let's see if we can actually make it at the end. And I ended up, in fact, making it at the end. It was 186 miles, I think it was, roughly there. It was 13 stops along the way. Stop at Starbucks, stop at a couple of chargers, hotel, took a client out to lunch, a whole bunch of errands I ran that day. But I made it to my hotel parking garage. It said 100.0% of my drive was on there. And I snapped a photo of that, and I was like a kid in a candy store. I couldn't believe it. It was that that one update I downloaded was just so much better. I texted all my personal friends, none of them that care about cars or autonomy, and everybody's like, okay, that's weird, David. Why are you sending it to us? But I literally spent close to an hour in the car, like talking about it. And at this time, like I'd always been on social media, I'd always been on X. Like I signed up, for Twitter when I was in the 7th grade. Um, I guess that must have been pre 2010 even. And, always been on there, but always never been a poster, always been a lurker. And so I start to do this page. I get to 500 miles or 700 miles. I start sending messages to like a Tesla reporter, full-time guy, Sawyer Merritt is his name. He's starting to post about like the streak that I'm doing. I just kept letting it roll. It was just, that number on the screen was a little bit addictive, and I just kept letting it roll. And then he was posting about it, and I was going anonymous, and I was like, I didn't really care. It's not my life. It's not, I never had any aspirations of making any, adjustments to my life. But when I got to 3,000 miles, I was like, why not? I'm going to post it about myself. And I started posting, started following that 3,001, ended up getting a couple 100,000 views. And selfishly, I was like, oh, this is kind of fun. This is kind of addicting. Why not, just continue to go? I'm still doing this insane amount of driving. And then, so I continued to go through on. So it took me from Raleigh, North Carolina. I drove all the way down to Miami, all the way up to Atlanta. I drove all the way to Houston, Texas, then to San Antonio. And then it took me to Dallas. It took me to Kansas City. It took me to Denver. It took me to Salt Lake City. And even on that stretch between Denver and Salt Lake, I came through Wyoming on this very stretch I'm talking to you today on. And there was 80-mile-an-hour winds that day, legitimate 80-mile-an-hour winds. It was in the middle of the winter, nasty. I saw 6 tipped over semi trucks within like a
Wow.
100-mile stretch or so. It was insane. And the car's doing 85 miles an hour in an 80-mile-an-hour zone, and it's killing it. It's staying in the lines. It never even hits the rumble strip once. I can't even believe what I'm witnessing. And then, I just keep on going, keep on talking about it every, one of these 1,000 milestones. So I was in Southern Oregon at the time. Just got, Ashland posted 6,000 miles without an intervention. And that was the first one Elon Musk reposted about. And that was pretty cool. That got millions of views. That was, really exciting. I never thought something like that would happen. He writes a nice, write up about it, shares it. And, and then cool. I finished my trip, see some people in Medford. I head home. I make it on Christmas Eve, get to have Christmas. And so that stint right there was 6,550 miles. I hadn't done anything. I make it home. I make this promise back to my family. Family and friends, I'm going to make it home for Christmas. And I do it. And then it's Christmas, and it's the day after. And then I'm starting to think, okay, we're at 6,550 miles. Like, I'm starting to think more and more, like I'd always been a fan, driving cars, especially like the Cannonball Run, and people started mentioning, the coast to coast and how far it had done. And I was kind of thinking like I couldn't be one of those maniacs that drives 100 miles an hour across the country, but maybe this is what I can do, and just, be the first to ride it autonomously. I never realized what I was getting myself into. I just thought it would be the kind of thing like, I really appreciated my grandfather that I mentioned earlier. And maybe it could be the kind of story that I shared to my grandchildren someday, just to say, when this is a commonplace thing that, I was the first to do this kind of thing. I never realized it would, turn my world upside down. So on December 26th, I leave home. I'd been gone for months and months. I tell my family I'm going to literally just sit in this car just to drive across the country. It's not even for work. It's just, just in my business, the business job, in between, New Year's or Christmas and New Year's is a slow period of time. And they just looked at me like I was, a weirdo. It was the most, I have a wonderful, wonderful family friends, but all of them were, the most judgmental I'd ever seen them. They just all looked at me like I was a weirdo. Like, what are you doing? You've been home, you just drove all this, and then you're just going to abandon us to sit in the car by yourself just to do this. And, somehow I, just kept on doing it, and I drove, and then I thought a symbolic starting point, which was pretty close to the water, would be the Tesla diner in Los Angeles, Hollywood area. And so I started there on Santa Monica Boulevard at the diner. It was 2 a.m. on a Sunday. And then 67 hours later, I found myself in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina at the Atlantic Ocean. And it was somehow a success. It was a wild couple days. I had one charger in particular that where there was a line that I ran into a lot of issues with, because the car can barely park itself in the spot. It's really cool that it can do that, but there was a line at this supercharger, and I did not listen to the trip planner. I wanted to go one stop further so I could have a nice lunch in the parking lot. I get to this charger at 2%. It's an old version 2 supercharger, so everybody's charging slow at 75 kilowatts, shared power. And then I get there and there's a long line, and I'm down to 2% battery. It's 80, 90 degrees out, and the AC's cooking. And so the car has to park there, but then I can't get in line because I'm a slave to the car. And so I have to sit there. I have to wait to get it clear. But this kind of supercharger, like this one, you can kind of see in the back, like in most of these, this one's 8 stalls, and they're all in a row. They're all nice and easy. You come in and they're back up in here. This one was a little different, where it was in the corner of the property. So it was 4 of them. 4 of them were pull through, and 4 of them were back in. The car's able to do both, but something about it being the both of those that very much confused it. And so when a spot did open up, a guy was starting to pull in and take it. And so I'm starting to honk on the horn and scream at him nicely, saying like, "Hey, that's my spot." But I can't tell him, I'm, pretty, frankly embarrassed at this point. And so it's hard to explain to people what you're doing. And so,
Because you don't want to touch the car and break your streak, right?
Yeah. I can't do any input at all. The only input I'm doing is just telling the navigation that I want to go to the supercharger, and it knows to park in. So I put the navigation into park in, and it was the one time on the trip that it kept missing the stall. It was parking one spot over. And so I tried it 4 or 5 times. It just didn't work. And I was like, all right, this is embarrassing enough. The guy's starting to get really frustrated at me because he's like, you don't even know how to park your car, basically. And then so I was just like, I gave him the spot. I started waiting again. I had it park in the parking lot. And then eventually somebody in the pull-in spot pulls in, and then I plug in with 1 or 0% on there. But yeah, I stayed in one hotel night on there. I have a home in Phoenix. I took a nap there, but 67 hours. It was pretty straightforward. It's kind of weird to say, but it was almost kind of boring in a sense, like uneventful. It was so good. There wasn't any noteworthy things, close calls or anything other than that charging situation. And that would have been avoided just by me listening to the trip planner better. And then I kind of found myself on there. So I roll into Myrtle Beach, and I go to the ocean, and then I go to the supercharger there, and I post about it, and it's about 2 or 3 in the morning, Eastern time. I start to post about it. And by the time 20 minutes later, the Tesla North America account reposted it. And then even in the middle of the night, the head of self-driving for Tesla, Ashok, he shares it. A whole bunch of people. Even before I go to bed, it has a couple million views. I can't believe it. Never experienced anything like this. Thought it was cool. Like some people would cheer me on, send some nice messages, but I never thought it was going to be. By the time I wake up, sleep in the whole drive, that's. It has over 10 million views. Elon Musk has shared that. The former head of Tesla AI, Andre Kapathi, shared it. Kathy Wood from ARK Investing.
And Kathy.
Yeah, and so many more people. Between today, between all my original post, Elon's post, and everybody else that reshared it, has a little over 100 million views.
Wow.
And then it just basically overnight has turned my world upside down. And then and then that's kind of there. And then the past couple months, I've been doing a lot of speaking engagements. I think I'm up to 5 or 6. Like that's where I met you, of course, at Ride AI Summit.
Yep.
And then this past weekend I was at one in Michigan at a Tesla event. And then one of the people that interviewed me throughout this whole process, his name was Devin Olson, one of my teammates on the Canadian trip. He's a Canadian Tesla autonomy tester, and him and I just particularly hit it off when we were doing this interview. And we just became really good friends out of it. And he came up with the idea is like, well, you had this good luck in America. Why don't we try it in Canada? And I was like, okay, that would be cool. Let's do it. And then we kind of kept it on the back burner. We were waiting until summer, basically, just because, the poor Canadian weather. And then And then I kind of just got the bug about it. I messaged him. He's a full-time videographer. He sets his own schedule. And then our co-driver, the craziest story at all, I call him up. I'm pretty good friends with him. And I just say like, hey, we're going to do this. I know you have some interest in coming. And he's like, oh, damn, like I'm actually going to be in the Galapagos Islands. And he was supposed to leave like the next day or the day after. This was around Memorial Day weekend. So he was taking off some extra time. And somehow on that phone call, I was just, friend to friend. I didn't offer him any money or anything. Like, if you just want to be a part of this, somehow I talked him out of going to the Galapagos Islands, canceling it, and flying to Seattle to come see me. And then he flew out, I think, the very next day, and then we met up with Devin the next day after, and then we drove across Canada, and that took us 4 days and 21 hours. And that was an exciting time. It was much more difficult. I'd been to Canada a couple times, but certainly, never driven that much distance. The United States stretch was 2,730 miles, and the Canada stretch was 3,760 miles.
Wow.
So it was over 1,000 miles more. But the biggest differentiator was, on my whole drive, I basically took I-10 to I-40. It's nice, big, open, guardrail, interstates. You take the exits, there's a million chargers. There's no problem solved. It's the easiest driving in the world. And I kind of thought that's what the Trans-Canada Highway was going to be, which it is in some parts. But the vast majority is, the equivalent of like a U.S. rural highway, or, your single lane road. Maybe it's double lane, but every, 20, 30, 50 miles, you go into the small town, you pass the post office, you got to go through the school zone, etc. It was all back and forth. You had FSD had to read numerous more speed limit signs. You're dealing with people pulling out onto the road that you wouldn't on a U.S. interstate. And then we just ran into a whole bunch of construction as well. And kind of the prime example of that, we were in Western Ontario, so we've made a good chunk of the way, maybe 1,500 miles. It's in the middle of the night. It's 12:30 in the morning. We're having difficulty booking a hotel. We didn't necessarily want to drive at night just because, it wasn't about, necessarily speed, but just about, actually accomplishing it, letting the car do, literally 100% of the driving. And then I guess our bigger goal than that is that we just didn't want to hate each other at the end of it. So we made sure to get hotel
Yeah.
rooms and get some time apart. And so we did that, but that particular night we were having trouble finding a hotel. Western, there's not that many hotels in many towns in, Western Ontario, but we call a town, 3 or 4 hotels, they'd all be booked. And it was like that for like 100, 200 miles. It was a long ways. And we finally get to this town, Dryden, I think the name was called. But right before there, it's in the, now it's past midnight, like I said, and there's construction going on the nighttime. And we get to a flagger, and the car recognizes the flagger, recognizes the stop sign. It stops there. And I just thought it was particularly impressive that, like a normal stop sign is stop, check everything and then proceed when it's good to go. But, in that flagger situation, it's stop and then wait there until told otherwise. So the car was able to
Sure.
recognize this flagger sitting there, and he's sticking it straight there, and the car is holding still. And we're so nervous because all he has to do is even just, move his arm a little bit and trick the car. He has no idea, what we're
Yeah.
doing,
Yep.
and the car just has to think about it. And this particular situation, it was closing down to one lane. So we were about to drive on the other side of the road. And so it all has to do is just do that. And then it's, our whole trip was a failure. We spent days doing this for nothing, but it it sticks. It does great. He turns it said slow instead of yield. I guess they all said slow in Canada, but same thing. It turns to the yellow triangle. And then we proceeded on our way, drove up the other side of the road, and made it to our hotel that evening. We ran into a couple more flaggers and stuff, and everything, but yeah, I mean, it made it a lot more exciting, a lot more thrilling. It was great. The other 2 people. The roads were just not in very good shape. I don't know if that's just because of the poor Canadian weather or what, but they were not. There was so many more potholes. There was a good stretch in Quebec that was 50 plus miles. I don't know if it was a brand new road or what it was, but there was absolutely no markings at all. It was a double lane highway. There was no left
Crazy.
shoulder line. There was no right shoulder line. There was no dividing lane line. Absolutely nothing. And it was FSD was driving on it. Granted, it would ride the rumble strip on and off, but it was, keeping still. And we're on this stretch of road that has no markings whatsoever. And then it starts to be cones, more construction. And then it takes us onto this dirt road to go onto the westbound side. So we're driving on this dirt road through the cones. We don't have a lead car or anything for the car to help
Crazy.
it. It starts driving on there, and then and then it knows the context that we're driving. We're driving eastbound now on the westbound side. The navigation is freaking out, because we're on
Right.
a divided freeway. It's saying like, keep turning, basically turn around, but the car overrides it. We ride that and take the way, and then continue on. And eventually throughout the drive, like, I'm not sponsored by Tesla, paid by them at all, but they were nice enough to reach out that they wanted to host us at the end. And then when we got there, they threw us a nice party at their Halifax, Nova Scotia service center. And we had about 20 people show up, and they gave us
That's
some nice
cool.
gifts and a tour, and it was really really welcoming. And then posted about it. The story was not as popular, but it still generated a ton of views. I think my post has 1 million views, just under 1 million views on it. And we got another congratulations from Ashok, the head of the Tesla AI, and their head engineer, and some other people, and some really kind messages. And there's their charging department head, Max. He shared some posts, and just about how you can really take any electric car all across North America, take the self-driving out of it. But yeah, and then now basically my world's turned upside down. I'm more or less doing this full time. It's kind of my full focus, talking about it every day, having more fun by the day. Made so many new friends, and experienced so many things. And go from just being a random blogger guy on social media to speaking at events I've always wanted to go to, Tesla EV, to getting media pass at multiple expos, CES, this ACT expo in Vegas. And it's just really transformed everything, and just something I ran into completely on accident.
Yeah. I mean, it's an incredible story. I've kind of, not to the same degree you did, but was so impressed by FSD that I started this company. And so your interest in this technology is awesome, because internally here at Autolane, a lot of what we've built and will continue to build is in a lot of ways you could think about it like an application for full self-driving. As soon as unsupervised full self-driving starts scaling, we've envisioned a world in which all these new types of transactions and deliveries and ride-hail opportunities are going to be turned upside down. And the second and third order effects are even greater than that. You talk about where you work and where you live, and real estate prices and commute times, and how FSD and unsupervised FSD will compete with regional airlines. And there's just so many just fantastic and awesome things to think about, how this technology will change the landscape for transportation, commerce, travel, all types of things. And so I guess one question I have for you, because we are constantly trying to figure out when more or less unsupervised FSD may finally come to customer cars. We have an internal estimation of that, and we don't have any private information or otherwise about when this might be, but it does seem like it's getting close. And I would love to hear your thoughts, given you're with this technology every day. If you were to guess, what month and what year will unsupervised FSD be shipped to a customer car?
Just any customer car, or like
Any customer car? Maybe just your car, whoever, the first person that's going to receive unsupervised FSD, meaning that person could take a nap in the back. They could send it out without anyone inside of it. Essentially what's happening with the robotaxi in Dallas, Houston, and Austin for Model Ys. When do you think a Model Y owner will first receive that same technology that enables their car to drive without anybody in it?
I would say about a year from now, maybe July 4th, 2027. I think from a technological standpoint, I think that all those advancements are going to come way ahead of time. But then, it's just kind of the government regulation part and, more or less the insurance part of it, when in an unsupervised sense, the liability, goes away from the driver and goes onto the manufacturer. I think that's going to be tough. But, in about a year or so, I could see somebody in Texas on, with a Model Y and on Tesla's insurance, being able to use that in some limited capacity. And then from like a nationwide, full national rollout, I think we're, unfortunately still a long ways from that, at least 5 years, I want to say. But, and so on that, but, I think they're just, yeah, it's not going to be as quick as people think. Tesla's, just if you want to put your car on the network or just in general, like they do not have any infrastructure. Right now in Austin and Houston and Dallas, like they're kind of, some of their cars are parked in dirt lots. Some of them are parked at their service center. Some of them are just in random parking lots, but they don't have like a true traditional like depot. Like you think of somebody like Waymo and, on all their depots they have set up and all their partnerships with like ABB and everything. They have like established depots and cleaning services and stuff. And the Tesla is like, they only have 50 cars and they're able to get away with a lot. They have a ton of permits. I've seen, in the Dallas area, 35,000 square foot building. You see autonomous car wash permits in Las Vegas. You see private, charging infrastructure, 60 stall facilities in Arizona. You see a lot there. They're, going to work on it, but I really don't think it's going to come as quick as people hope. I'm sad to say that because I wish it was the other way.
David, I have a quick question. Going back to your trip, so you did a full 100% on both trips. Where does your car sit now in terms of stats on the amount of self-driving that you accomplish?
Yeah, so since this 14.2 came out in, just before Thanksgiving, I've driven 35,964 miles and then 35,867 miles, so 103 miles out of there. So I think it's 99.97%
Wow.
has been driven. About half those miles has been, throughout this, process. Very fortunate that, Tesla has given me like early access to the software now with some of the people you see on YouTube. So some of the time I drive manually and just to set the car up for situations to, test out the new software. But, it's still rounds up to 100%, but it's, yeah, I mean, under 100 miles since there. And I've driven 3 times further since Thanksgiving than most people do in a whole year. So,
yeah. In what mode were you on? Standard? Were you on, chill? Were you on Mad Max? Did you switch between the modes, or did you stick with one the entire time?
So on the USA one, I just switched between the modes when I felt like it. Some people, I don't necessarily agree with it. Some people consider that like an intervention of some sorts. That's some kind of human input, which is kind of a fair shake. So I was changing around on there. And then we tried to do the same thing in Canada. We kept it on standard and we made it literally like 95% of the way. And then the rain got to be so bad in Halifax or in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick that we changed it down to sloth. But so that would be the only input. But yeah, we definitely did. I did change the profiles on both attempts, but from turn signals and the rest, touching the wheel, touching the accelerator, touching the brake, nothing else, but just basically setting a speed tolerance to what I, thought I could get away with the police.
If they shipped unsupervised FSD to your car right now, beamed it over on that Starlink you got installed, would you use it?
Oh,
would you trust your life with it?
Yeah, 100%. As long as it was a clear day out and everything, like today, it's a beautiful 78 degrees. I would certainly, feel comfortable.
You crawl in the
my
back
ass
right
off the
now and
road.
take a nap and let your car drive you to the next spot?
Oh
today?
yeah. I wouldn't say that. I've had that asked a couple times since this has all happened, and but now recently on this particular last update, 14.3.3, and they've merged the stacks between robotaxi and the customer consumer cars. I've noticed another great improvement. But yeah, for the first time, I can say that I'd be more than glad being in the back seat in a regular situation.
I came to that conclusion yesterday for the first time. I decided I've also done not anywhere near as much FSD as you, but I only use FSD. And I've now done that for 2 years. I suppose even before you, I started in August of 2024, and even on 12.5, I didn't drive. So I've not driven almost now for 2 years, and it wasn't until I'd say I got pretty comfortable on 14.2, but like certainly in the last 6 months, I've now gotten to the point where I would be comfortable moving to the back seat and not supervising. And
I would
have
say
always said that, but yeah,
it's a better driver than certainly myself. Most people,
Yep.
I feel like it's really hard for a human to call themselves a below average driver, but this is certainly a certainly like exceptional driver. Just from its 360 vision alone, but it sees so many things that I couldn't react to. Just from roadkill and stuff. There was one example I just had crossed back into Canada or back into America from Canada last week, and I just got in Maine. It's in the middle of the night. It's dumping down rain. It's, 1 a.m, and I'm going around this bend, and I can't even see it in the car, and the car swerves out of the way, and it swerved out of a possum family. So many things it's avoided, tires on the road. I've even had it, avoid. There was one example that a Home Depot bucket fell out of a service truck, and it avoided that. And so many other things. I mean, it just always aware, never distracted, never tired. It sees stuff that I don't see constantly all the time. It was another example. I forget where I was at. I was in Las Vegas for the ACT Expo, and I was driving, and then it just slammed on the brakes, and I was looking around, and I don't get concerned about that anymore. And then all of a sudden, this girl was driving across the street in her scooter, and it beat me to it. Like I saw it within half a second, but it already slammed on the brakes before it got out of my A-pillar gap, and this was less than a second. It really 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 shines.
Yeah, that's the thing that makes me have so much belief in it, is that awareness, that kind of superhuman awareness that there is no way, I don't care how good of a driver you are, there is no way that you can install eyes in the back of your head. You can't. So I don't care how good of a driver you are, you're never going to outperform a self-driving car, because the self-driving car has a 360 observation in real time, and you've only got, you're limited, not even 90 degrees, right? So it's fascinating to me, the difference of things that you wouldn't be able to observe, that the car observes, things that are behind you, things that are the side of you, to your point. And so for that reason alone, I solely trust my car and would trust my car over myself at any given moment, because again, I even if I'm fully rested, had a cup of coffee, focused, no one's in the car, both hands on the wheel, trying to act like an F1 driver and be hyper focused, even in that sense, I still can't see behind myself at the same time. I still can't see the side of myself at the same time. So there's just no chance that I'm ever going to outperform a car with that capability. So I think, yeah, it's such an incredible general purpose technology, and it's going to be fascinating to watch the ways in which this changes, all parts of society. I do believe we're going to get to a point where traffic deaths and casualties and severe accidents are going to be so low that they'll be news worthy, which of course they aren't today. Nobody responds to a bad car accident. It happens constantly, every hour, unfortunately. And we're so numb to it. But I do think in my lifetime, when my kids are able to drive, we're going to get to a point where the idea that someone died in a car accident is going to be very tragic. It's going to be looked at as something preventable, avoidable, and wasn't necessary in the end. But we're not there today quite yet, but I do think this technology is going to lead to that.
David, this brings me to one other super interesting topic, kind of on the back of what Ben was saying. You're a lidar salesman, and one of the biggest rifts, if you will, in self-driving is vision versus lidar. What's the better system? What's safer? How do you map better? And you have like an extremely interesting insight into both of these things. What's your take on lidar versus vision?
So I say there's, pros and cons, to, each philosophy. I think in a theoretical sense, like, a lidar, it's not necessarily lidar versus vision. It's, lidar plus vision plus, plus radar, it's that whole sensor suite. I think it's tough to argue that, running that setup is not, in a theoretical sense is better than the vision for sure. Like, I think it's hard to deny that, but I think the vision has the real advantage of just, cost to deployment. I, take the tax incentive out of it. Like, you can buy this car I'm in for, for $35,000. It costs a Waymo setup to buy, their Jaguar vehicle, and then, $100,000 plus on there. So, just on there, even if it is a little bit better, it's still not attainable for most of the world. Like, we need this to, deploy to the masses for it to be a, a sustainable thing, and, make those tragedies of, auto accidents, go away. So I think there's that sense, and maybe it's theoretically, but they seem to have a real sensor fusion problem, and they have a, currently have a real problem about just having to be in a predetermined map zone. I've talked about traveling these thousands of miles of distances, and I don't think, a Waymo or any of these in their current sense could do that, even if they had the entire, I don't think they could have built a model that's big enough to, cover this entire stretch, let alone the entire United States. You need a whole, end to end, network. I think the real thing is not necessarily the vision, vision versus the lidar, but just the fact that the, Tesla's approach is that you can take it anywhere. It's just, seeing the world as it is, like a human driving. You don't need to be, in these pre-map zones. I can take this on any, any road in the world, and it's going to perform the same. And, you can't drop a Waymo, you can't drop a Zoox onto any street in the world. But I mean, there's advantages. The lidar can see so much further. These little tiny itty bitty 5 megapixel cameras, they can't see that far. They have to use a whole bunch of AI and lidar validation to figure out, where that is in 3D depth versus, I don't know the Waymo's statistics, but the lidars I'm using and working with, they shoot out 300 meters of range. That's almost 1,000 feet, and they capture 2 million data points per second. 360 by 270 degrees. So they're seeing basically the entire world, gathering millions of measurements. 1,000 up to 1,000 feet away, the whole environment, all within a second. Versus this little tiny camera. There's just so much more data, but the more data there is, the more it bogs down and confusion. But so I think this is, a better approach. Maybe those in the world, maybe they are a little bit safer in the long term. I'm not necessarily like an expert on that front, but I think it's, this has been a fantastic solution, and it, comes at an affordable price that, most people can afford. Model Y is the most popular vehicle in the world, and this is proven to be, already a 10 times safer, system than a human driving. Eventually, it's going to be 100. Eventually, it's going to be 1,000, and it's going to what's going to change the world. But again, all about, having that end to end, being able to take it anywhere versus the pre-mapped is probably the biggest differentiator, I would say.
Yeah, we would definitely agree with you here. Do you have, as we wrap up here, do you have any other drives planned? What's your next trip, or have you not thought that far ahead
Yes,
yet?
I have thought about it. I'd love to hear your guys' thought. And before I forget, just one thing about autonomy, one thing that, really drives me to talk about, and we talked about safety. We talked about, just how cool it is. Like, I mean, this makes, like, I drove 1,050 miles yesterday. It's, super stressful. I can go so much further in the drive. But I think the biggest thing that's not talked about much is just how much autonomy is going to bring independence to those in need. You have people, elderly people, and, hundreds of thousands of elderly people a year give up driving, and those people on average live about 68 years in the research I found. So that's millions and millions of people that were just right there that could be, could have an autonomous car, regain their independence. And then somebody, a special story. My father, he's completely blind in the last couple of years. He's completely lost all his independence. He relies on my mother and I to, take care of him, to drive him to all his doctor appointments, drive him to the grocery store, anywhere he needs to go. But if he was able to buy an autonomous car, he could afford it. He could buy it today, and he could regain a lot of that independence and not have to rely on other people. And you could shuttle the children around. There's just, so many things. It's about the safety, but there's just so many people that are going to benefit. It's going to make the world a better place on there. And then going back to the drives, I'd love to hear your input, because I'm kind of debating which route to go. It's either going to be very fast or very slow, but it's all around all 50 states. So I want to drive all 50 states on FSD. So 48 in
Yo.
my own car, and then the last two I'd have to fly and have a supporter let me borrow the car. But I'm either going to do it within a week, in 1 week, 7 days, which is theoretically possible. I'd have to have some friends join me. You'd have to drive 24/7 and then fly to Alaska and then fly to Hawaii. I've done the math. I've double checked it a couple times. It's possible. So either do that, see the whole country in a week, or go super slow, 50 states in 50 days, and kind of do more of like a autonomy tour of sorts, and take it slow, and talk about more, and meet more people and stuff. But that's kind of my summer plans at the moment. But I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts. But
My answer is going to be inspired by the World Cup. I'm going to say you should take it from Canada through United States into Mexico.
That's a good idea. Starting
because Mexico has FSD, right? I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and I've never seen anyone. So I lived in Latin America for quite some time and speak Spanish, and I'm just a big believer in that part of the world. And I think what's fascinating is there's been a lot of stuff with Western Europe when it comes to autonomy, UAE, China, of course, United States, but FSD is about to come out in Colombia as well. And so the entire Latin American world hasn't really had much autonomy exposure, nor kind of a spotlight. So I think doing this through Mexico would be an incredible, you could, you'd be eating pretty well the entire time, but
yeah.
B, I think you would be a rock star. I think that this idea, when it starts coming into Latin America, is going to be pretty mind blowing. So maybe do a World Cup tour, USA, Canada, Mexico. That's what I would do.
That's a great idea.
I vote for the very fast, and I think you need a snack partner. Like, you need to find someone to sponsor your snacks, because I can't imagine all of that time. Like, if you don't have a snack partner yet, David, you got to put something out there for getting a snack partner and getting some video crew to follow you, because this is documentary worthy. This is awesome.
Yeah, and I would say you need a caffeine partner, but to be honest, with FSD, you don't really need that.
More like maybe a book or Kindle.
Let's not push it, producer Kyle.
Audible.com sponsorship.
Yeah.
There you go.
There you go. But I'm serious. You should be getting a documentary crew on that and a snack partner.
I want to ask that question before we go. I'm very curious. You're putting in so many solo miles in a car and you're not driving it. I get extremely bored on FSD by myself on road trips. Are you an audiobook guy here? Are you music only? Are you a mix? How do you just sit in your thoughts and raw dog it? What are you doing?
Yeah, so I think the first part is honestly think I don't know if it's the alone time or just being in the car, but something about just being in the car in this long stretch is very therapeutic for myself. I feel like it's kind of almost like being in the shower, since you're just away from everything, like the shower thoughts. But I feel like when I'm driving on this long stretch that I wouldn't say I'm doing this maybe it's a half hour at a time or there, but I'm thinking, in the long term, thinking about these next steps of life and all aspects. So I really just get a kick out of that. It's like my way to get away from the world. You're kind of seeing nature. Obviously, I'm still connected to the Starlink. I still have the internet, etc. But I've always gotten a kick out of that. But just phone calls, work, not like big on the audiobooks at the moment. I have YouTube Premium, so like I'll download some interviews, or I'm really into golf. You can see my golf clubs here. They always come with me. That's part of why I like to drive so
Nice.
much.
Let's go.
So I'll listen to golf reviews. On X, there's always spaces that are there to listen to. Sometimes, especially in the Canada, we do a bunch of live streams, but kind of whole sort. But really never truly get bored. I mean, I drove 1,000 miles yesterday. I'm going to drive 900 miles total today, and every time I get in the car and there it's like like a kid in a candy store. I'm super excited. It's gonna, even though it's been the 1,000th time, it's gonna it's gonna pull me out of the supercharger. It's gonna get on the freeway. It's gonna get all the do the whole entire drive, and it's always gonna blow me away just from that aspect. I can't even believe that how fortunate and lucky I am to being alive in the time I am and get to experience all this and get to share and document it. And it's just been the ultimate joy. It's been the greatest 6-8 months of my life so far. So just keeps getting better.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for sharing the story with us and tuning in from the road. We've been very fortunate to have you, and good luck on the journey. Stay in touch, and maybe we'll tap in with you, later this year or next year after your next epic adventure.
We'd love to have you back after the next trip, man. We really appreciate you.
Yeah, would love to come back. Thank you guys again, and look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thank you again.
Thanks,
Talk
David.
soon.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, David.